Welcome, everyone, to the Ohio Department of Education Social Studies meetup today. I want to set up a few ground rules before we begin our discussion. These ground rules are based on ground rules from Glenn Singleton's work through Courageous Conversations About Race. First, stay engaged. Keep your focus on what is happening in front of you. Take in as much information as you can. Be willing to experience discomfort. We are talking about things that may make you wiggle in your seats a bit, but that's okay. We wiggle and we learn. Speak your truth because you are the only one that knows your truth. Assume positive intention of those around you, and finally accept non-closure, because this is a ongoing discussion and you may not find a peace or resolution at the end of it, but it means that you are an ongoing learner. A long time ago, in a classroom not too far away, a kindergarten first grade teacher shared a poem with her students that goes something like this. Harriet Tubman didn't take no stuff, wasn't scared of nothing either. Didn't come in this world to be no slave, didn't stay one either. That teacher is our guest speaker today. Dr. Cynthia Tyson is a full professor at The Ohio State University. She is an internationally recognized scholar in social justice education, early childhood social studies, and multicultural children's literature. Dr. Tyson walks her talk, promoting and practicing equity in the classroom, in her church, and as an LSW working with hospice in Central Ohio. Dr. Tyson will be presenting Race and Racism, Developing a Personal Understanding. If you have questions, please feel free to use the Q&A box. We will relay those questions to Dr. Tyson, who will take them at the end of her presentation. It is my great honor to present our guest, my friend of over 30 years, Dr. Cynthia Tyson, who, like Harriet Tubman, doesn't take no stuff.
Thank you and good morning. I am just going to ask quickly, is my screen sharing? Elizabeth? Okay, she turned.
Yeah, it's coming.
Turned hers off so that I can share. Yes?
Yes.
All right, good morning, good morning. I am very pleased and honored to be here, and thank you to my dear friend for such an amazing introduction. Makes me stop and say, who's getting ready to speak? So pretty amazing, and I thank you so much for that. As was mentioned, today we're going to talk about developing a personal understanding about race and racism. This is not a session where you will get recipes for how to go and discuss and talk and teach about race, although I'll get to a little of that at the end. But that's not the purpose of today's session. The purpose of this virtual meetup is to talk about the kinds of things that are necessary to develop a deeper understanding of race and racism for oneself. There's a saying about teaching that when you are able to teach something through the window of your own understanding, you are able to be better at relaying whatever that concept may be. So in this case, we're talking about social studies and history and all of those kinds of concepts, but it's also the same in mathematics and any other thing that you do, crocheting, painting. When you have a deeper understanding, yourself, then it is through that window that you're able to facilitate the teaching and learning and greater understanding of others. And so that's where we're going today. Let me. All right, so I'm calling today a courageous conversation, although I'm going to be the talking head. A little bit later, you'll be able to ask some of your questions, so please don't be shy and get those in the chat box to be shared later. I'm going to start off talking a little bit about just the overall challenges, the kinds of things that people even at the very beginning begin to think about in terms of not only themselves, but most of all about children and why is this even important. I'm going to share some definitions and some examples. And then a little bit toward the end, I'm going to sort of segue us into having a conversation about teaching about race and what those best practices are. And I'll say conversation, even though this is one way for now, but hopefully later we'll be able to move to us having some back and forth about that. So one of the things that comes to mind almost immediately, not only in the literature, but also for those who are working with young people, and here it says children, because I'm thinking about the early ages as it moves through all the way to high school. They're still kids and their development, pointing us to the brain research that says the frontal lobe, for which there is lots of work that happens around discerning and decision making and figuring out the world, happens at 25 or older. And so this can be not only pre-K, but even to the early ages of their collegiate experience. So the question is, are children or young people too young to talk about race? And the answer to that is no. Young children, they notice and they think about race. And as adults, we often worry that if we talk about it, that we'll encourage some kind of racial bias in children. And that's absolutely the opposite of that is true. The talking about race opens up the possibilities of being able to conceptualize, to challenge, and to think about what does it mean that we live in a race-based and often marginalizing of those who are racialized in our society. Silence about race just reinforces racism, letting young people and children come up with their own conclusions. And I don't know about you, that's not always a good idea to let them come up with their own ideas about how something works or why it works, but instead to talk with them and help facilitate them thinking differently than what they may be experiencing. And finally, teachers and families can really play a powerful role. We spend a great amount of time with children and young people in our work. The attitudes that they have, and here I say positive, but even negative attitudes about race and diversity and all of the skills that it takes to be able to negotiate that in their lives will only happen if we talk about it. So I'm going to share just sort of a little bit of the research. I am a research nerd, so I own that. I'm not going to spend a lot of time there, but please know that if you need more research about any of this, I have tons. So let's talk about what happens at birth and why this is an important thing to start very early all the way through a lifelong process. At birth, babies look equally at faces of all races. 3 months, they look at faces that match the race of their caregiver. And so the research shows that they're able to do that kind of looking, and it's different. Children as young as 2 years old will use race to reason about other people's behavior. They're able to determine that there's something that's different about this person, and as they're making sense of what they do, what they say, they're able to track and be able to see that this person looks different. This person is from a different place. This person speaks differently. You know, I have to throw in there that race is not the only marker, but it definitely is one. By 30 months, most children use race to choose their playmates. And I don't know how many of you saw this video. It's one that I watched over and over when I need an uplift in my day, of these two little guys who were friends and they were meeting each other on the street and gave each other this amazing embrace. Finally, well, I shouldn't say finally, expressions of racial prejudice often begin to peak around 4 and 5. And at 4 and 5, what's happening? We see that they are also becoming parts of school communities. By 5, Black and Latinx children, and much of the research showed that they have a preference toward their own groups compared to white children who at this age remain strongly are in bias of favor of whiteness. And so any of us who've been in schools know, and I was a former first grade, kindergarten, first grade, fourth grade teacher, thought about teaching 8th grade for about 10 minutes or so. So my middle school people out there, great love and respect for you for what you do. But we watch out on the playground, and I can remember as a classroom teacher looking out my window onto the playground, and you begin to see by the time the children are first graders, second graders, they're beginning to divide themselves into these groups, and these groups often look like the Black children playing together, the white children playing together, and that doesn't happen as much, and it's shown in the research when they're younger. By the time they're in kindergarten, also, they will show many of the same sorts of racial attitudes that adults hold in our culture today. The picture that I'm showing here is the doll test, and any of you who are interested can look that up. Just Google the doll test with Dr. Kenneth, and his last name went out the top of my head, but doll test will show up. And what he did back in the early 1960s is he showed children 2 dolls, a white doll and a Black doll. And he asked them, which is the good doll and which is the bad doll? And every child chose the white doll as the good doll and the Black doll as the bad one. This was repeated in some work done in like the year 2006 or 7 as well, and the same results happened. The children still made those choices. And when they were talked to about it, they were like, well, why do you think that? What do you think this brown doll will grow up to do? And what do you think this white doll will grow up to do? And many of those values are the same ones that we see that kind of permeate within our culture and our society today. The next one is about having these explicit conversations. And by the time they're 5 to 7 years old, they may begin to have some interracial friendships, but those attitudes will drastically improve if those explicit conversations are had. And so talking about race and knowing that there is no age where telling children the truth is not a good idea. Excuse me. So as we move forward in our work today, I'd like for you to think about which one of these statements best describe your most current thinking. And I would say, when you ask yourself, would you rather not talk about race or racism? We can add a slash there. Are you uncomfortable? Are you very uncomfortable about talking about race? Do you find maybe that you're usually uncomfortable or sometimes uncomfortable or usually comfortable or just very uncomfortable? Now, I know this would be determined often by the context in which you are working or living, but you can ask yourself these statements across not only your personal life, but also your work life, as well as any other context that you may find yourself in. Maybe you have a faith community that you operate in, or you have other social groups or clubs that you're a part of. Ask yourself, where in your most current thinking do you find yourself? And then as we move through today's discussion, hopefully it'll help you be able to determine how you can shift and move from wherever you are on this continuum as needed so that you can become more comfortable. So we're going to start off with some definitions. We're going to call a thing a thing. I love Dr. Seuss, and we often, when we have these conversations, try to find language that's nice and pleasant. And I'm not going to say mean or things that will make you, to hurt you, but there'll be some things that you might hear that are not going to feel comfortable, as my good friend Dr. Bridges said at the beginning. And if you're uncomfortable, that's okay, hang in there, but you can always come back to it. But we're going to name some things, we're going to call them what they are, and we're going to use experiences and examples to help with that. Remembering that we can have a greater understanding when we begin to look and distinguish around issues of race and racism and racial prejudice and stereotyping and discrimination. So let's start off with racial prejudice. Racial prejudice is judgment, opinions, attitudes, or feelings formed before the facts are known, or disregarding the facts that contradict them as they are related to race, before they are known or disregarded as they are weighed up against the facts. Racial discrimination, then, is the act or practice of giving different treatment to persons according to their racial or ethnic group membership. With prejudice, it can sit just with the person. So a person can believe that Black people, brown people, other people of color, they behave a particular way. You may not have the facts about that. It may be something that you learned as a child. It may be something that you've just observed because you know one or two people. But racial discrimination moves that needle to a different place because now you can treat that person differently because of that. We don't always treat people differently because of information that we have about them. But when it comes to race, we find that this is often the case. Now let's talk about what is race. You know, race is an ideology, it's a construct, it's made up. We assign to a racial or ethnic group, to a position of power over others based on physical and cultural attributes. What people look like is what we've assigned privilege and power to, with no regard to other aspects of that person. Race has no biological basis. Race has no biological basis. All the same, race is really, really powerful because in a racialized experience, it can have life or death consequences. And we've seen this over time historically, all the way from the beginning of enslavement as related to chattel slavery in 1619, moving us through what was quote unquote emancipation, Jim Crow, Reconstruction, the Civil Rights Movement, and then even today as we see that a racialized experience that has nothing deterministic based on biology can be a matter of life and death. And that's why it's so important. Culture. Culture is something that's defined as a shared behavior, thoughts, or values of a group. It's a group of people. It's what you believe will impact your life, what you think, what you value, and it's part of a group. We know teenagers, for an example, have a culture, right? We talk about adolescents have a culture. There's certain things that they as a group kind of believe is true, be it true or not. But this is the same thing that happens across other groups. What is a shared belief and a value? Sometimes it's related in religion. It doesn't have to be. It could be religion or spirituality. It could be things like how we care for our elders. It could be about the types of things that children do. Our understanding of childhood and what a child should do or not be able to do is all a part of that. Ethnicity then is a group that's characterized by shared history and also a country of origin, language. It could be religion and ancestry. But the differences here is that often ethnicity is rooted within a country of origin or a shared religion. So now we get to privilege. And this is sometimes a charged place because people think, oh, well, I'm called privileged, but I'm not necessarily feeling it. Well, let's look at privilege. Privilege is access to benefits, advantages, opportunities based on a social category or group membership. But it's always connected to something that is of value within a particular group or a society. No one feels privileged or about having access to something that is not valued. So no one is talking about, oh, the privilege of being able to not to not have a job, the privilege of unemployment, all of the things that we value in our society. And if a person, because of in a particular group, has privilege, like when we talk about white privilege, those are benefits and advantages, and they're not always ones that are asked for. Sometimes these are just accrued to you based on generational experiences across history. Now, we can't have a conversation about race and racism without having a conversation about power. And the power is the capacity to make decisions, to define reality, and shape beliefs and values. So the power of racism's oppression will serve the needs and interests of the privileged. Again, we've seen this across history. So a quick example will be after chattel slavery was ended. Then we moved into an area of Jim Crow, and then voting rights became an issue. And we hear this often still in the news today. When the politicians of the North were concerned about all of these newly freed Black formerly enslaved Africans becoming now a part of the electorate and able to vote, then there was a law, the power to change and shape and define reality. A law was enacted that said that each of these Black formerly enslaved individuals would only count for 3/5 of a person. So that when the numbers were decided for representation in Washington, then even though people were being counted, you didn't count the Black folks as whole people. Again, that's where racism connected to power can control not only access and benefits and advantages, but it also defines a reality. So now I'm going to move on to racism and really talking about what that definition is. And there are two definitions that I really love, both by Tatum and then Barnt and Ruel. Tatum's is all the way back to 1977, and then Barnt, I always say his name wrong, and Ruel are 1992. And the researcher and teacher and professor in me says 1977, that's, a long time ago, as it relates to research. But I say if something's not broken, let's not try to fix it. These two definitions are the most powerful and have been since they've been presented, and they're easy to sort of hang our hats on. So racism is a system of advantage or disadvantage, which may be privilege in terms of advantage, based on race. That's it. Are you advantaged in your life because of your race? Are you disadvantaged? An example of that would be if you ever have to think about or ask yourself the question, was I treated differently because of my race? And if you never have to ask yourself that question, then you have an advantage based on your race versus someone who has a disadvantage based on their race. Racism is racial prejudice plus institutional power. So often people will ask the question, well, but I don't have any power. Well, we're talking about an institution, we're talking about a system, and we'll get to that in just a little bit. So advantage and disadvantage based on race. And it is also racial prejudice with institutional power. So again, racism is prejudice and power, and I've already, we saw that in the earlier slide. So there are 4 different levels that are pretty much in all of the literature that I'd like to share. And this is really important for your own personal understanding. You can't begin to even think about being anti-racist or dismantling racism or confronting racism in your teaching, in your classrooms, in your interactions with others until you really understand that it's a thing that operates on multiple levels. So therefore, it's going to require something different from you. If we are trying to get to a particular destination and our destination is, let's say, a park in our neighborhood, If I'm going to drive my car, it's going to require something different of me. If I'm going to ride a bicycle, it's going to require something different of me. If I'm going to walk, oh Lord, it really requires something different of me. So when you're talking about operating on these different levels, each and every one of these levels requires something different if we're going to combat and really address what is required for fighting racism. So let's look at the individual and personal definition. Beliefs, attitudes, and actions of individuals. That seems pretty self-explanatory, that perpetuate racism, but I don't want us to lose it as conscious and unconscious. We're not talking about all the time people who wake up and say to themselves, hey, I want to be racist today, and I'm going to go out and find somebody to enact some racism against. Now, I'm not saying that there aren't people who may believe that way, because we often don't think about that, but it isn't always conscious. Some of it is unconscious, implicit bias. Unconscious bias also happens. It's not always the evil, but that doesn't negate that the evil is not there. A person's belief that there is superiority in their own racial group. And this is expressed through, again, their attitudes and behavior, but that also helps to maintain those superior and inferior positions. And this is the one that is most closely related to racial prejudice, and that is being able to treat people differently. So let's think about what it means for this to be sort of, well, let me keep going. Here's an example. A parent explains to a child that a classmate can't be as smart as she is because people in that racial group just aren't as smart as people in their racial group. A colleague expresses to another that the new executive, or we could say in this place, teacher, principal, whoever, was only hired to meet a racial quota. A store manager instructs a salesperson to keep an eye on patrons who belong to a particular racial group. I can say to you that I've experienced every single one of these. I've had people say to me when I was hired as a classroom teacher, started my very first job, someone says, well, you know, I know you're going to probably be a really good teacher, but, you know, we had to make sure that we had to hire another Black person to be hired in our building. I've heard parents say that they're concerned about their child being in a particular group, back when we used to do reading groups, because, well, you know, kids from that racial group aren't read to at home, or Black kids are not read to at home. They're not as literate, and I don't want my child to be brought down. So again, and the last one being followed in a store. Again, back to that advantage and disadvantage based on race. Am I being followed in the store because I'm a Black woman? Or am I being followed in the store because this person wants to help me? Usually about the fourth or fifth time they ask me, can they help me? And I say no, I'm pretty sure that it's not just because they want to help me, but because of some belief about a particular group. The next one is institutional racism, which is structural racism. You hear about it. And these are treatments or related into policies. These are policies and practices that, based on a particular race of a person, result in inequitable outcomes for whites over people of color, and then extend way beyond what that individual prejudice might be. It really is the most profound and pervasive form of racism, and understanding that is really an important place to be. We really need to understand what is systemic racism. And so at this point, I'd like to share a short video that will explain that very well.
This is Jamal. Jamal is a boy who lives in a poor neighborhood. He has a friend named Kevin, who lives in a wealthy neighborhood. All of Jamal's neighbors are African American, and all of Kevin's neighbors are white. Because Jamal's school district is mostly funded by property taxes, his school is not very well funded. His classrooms are overcrowded, his teachers are underpaid, and he doesn't have access to high-quality tutors or extracurricular activities. Kevin's school district is also funded by property taxes, so his school is very well funded. His classrooms are never crowded, his teachers are very well paid, and he has access to high-quality tutors and lots of extracurricular activities. Kevin and Jamal live only a few streets away from each other. So how come they're growing up in such different worlds with such different opportunities for success? The answer has to do with America's history of systemic racism. To understand it better, let's look at what life was like for Kevin and Jamal's grandparents. Decades after the Civil War, many government agencies started to draw maps dividing cities into sections that were either desirable or undesirable for investment. This practice was called redlining, and it usually blocked off entire black neighborhoods from access to private and public investment. Banks and insurance companies used these maps for decades to deny black people loans and other services based purely on race. Historically speaking, owning a home and getting a college education is the easiest way for an American family to build wealth. But when Jamal's grandparents wanted to buy a house, the banks refused because they lived in a neighborhood that was redlined. So Jamal's grandparents were not able to buy a home, and because colleges could prevent them from attending through legal segregation, their options for higher education were really scarce. Kevin's grandparents, on the other hand, got a low-interest loan to buy their first house and got accepted into a handful of top universities, which traditionally only accepted white students. This opened up a wealth of opportunities that they were able to pass on to their kids and grandkids. Even as late as the 1980s, an investigation into the Atlanta real estate market showed that banks were more willing to lend to low-income white families than to middle or upper-income African-American families. As a result, today, for every $100 of wealth held by a white family, black families have $5.04. A 2017 study confirms that redlining is still affecting home values in major cities like Chicago today. This explains how Kevin and Jamal inherited vastly different circumstances. Unfortunately, the story doesn't end there. A big part of systemic racism is implicit bias. These are prejudices in society that people are not aware that they have. Let's go back to Kevin and Jamal. Against all odds, Jamal manages to be the only student from his high school to get accepted into a great university, the same one that Kevin and his high school friends are attending. But after Kevin and Jamal both graduate, Jamal notices that his resume isn't drawing as much interest as Kevin's, even though they graduated from the same program with the exact same GPA. Unfortunately for Jamal, studies show that resumes with white-sounding names get twice as many callbacks as identical resumes with black-sounding names. Implicit bias is one of the reasons why the black unemployment rate is twice the rate of white unemployment, even among college graduates today. You can see evidence of systemic racism in every area of life. The disparities in family wealth, incarceration rates, political representation, and education are all examples of systemic racism. Unfortunately, the biggest challenge with systemic racism is that there's no single person or entity responsible for it, which makes it very hard to solve. So what can you do? The first thing you can do is work towards becoming more aware of your own implicit biases. What are some prejudices that you might hold that you're not aware of? Second, let's acknowledge that the consequences of slavery and Jim Crow laws are still affecting access to opportunity today. As a result, we should support systemic changes that create more equal opportunities for everyone. Increasing public school funding and making it independent from property taxes would be a great start, so that poor and wealthy districts can receive equal access to resources. Systemic problems require systemic solutions. Luckily, we're all part of the system, which means that we all have a role to play in making it better. Peace.
It really does an outstanding job of helping us understand that systemically means not that there are things that individuals do. Now, that doesn't mean that individual things are not damaging, because they are. And they, as I said, can not only be hurtful on the personal level, but they can also be hurtful as it relates to education, to housing. But the systemic nature of racism is much greater and beyond the personal acts. These are things that we often maybe hear someone says, well, you know, this person is just a bad apple, or it's beyond that sort of, we have a few bad apples syndrome. This is about paying attention to the fact that as it relates to a hate crime or jobs or housing, negative comments might be a part of it in a workplace. Racial profiling is a part of that. Or even, excessive force and violence by a police officer toward a Black, brown, or person of color. So these are systemically related, and they are not just the individual, but again, policies and practices that are there. And we really need to move beyond that if we're going to confront what's happening with racism. So here's a couple of examples, and I shared some. A bank refuses a mortgage for a purchase of a home in a neighborhood that is mostly Latino or Latinx, African American, or new immigrant groups may reside. We might see a local media coverage of a particular inner city or urban neighborhood that's only about criminal activity, or maybe a nonprofit organization that is supposed to be there to help all people only has images and cultural perspectives that reflect a particular dominant racial group, even like say in its church bulletins or in information boards. So when we look at cultural racism, the definition of that is these are individual and institutional racist understandings that express superiority or domination of a racist cultural heritage over another race. This is, again, one group that holds power over another. And let's look at some examples of that. A Korean merchant requires, as a condition of employment, that employees communicate with him in his language, even though the business may be located in a place that's more racially diverse. You can have an African American receptionist, let's say here at a medical office, or I would say maybe even in a school building, who is noticeably agitated when engaging with patients or parents and community members who do not speak English. A school continues to use Native American images as its mascot. We've seen a lot of conversation about that after having community members request that it's not done. A definition of racism that's not talked about nearly as much as this whole idea of internalized racism. And internalized racism is about feelings, destructive feelings about behaviors experienced by recipients of racism when they've internalized those stereotypes, racial prejudices, and misinformation about their own racial group. I don't know why that number 8 is there, but we can just pretend like it's not. This whole idea that when I have lived my whole life as a Black, brown, or person of color, indigenous person, the feelings and the behaviors that are experienced by me become internalized, and I begin to not only believe some of those things about other people who look like me, I may even believe that my capacity for success and access is impaired or limited because of that. And I begin to internalize that. Often we see internalized racism exhibit itself in ways that are destructive. Here's a couple of examples. Expressing thoughts, attitudes, or as I said, engaging in behaviors that purport laziness or inferiority or unimportance or stupidity of a particular group. The practice of placing higher value on members of a racial group, as we saw with the doll test, things about skin color, hair texture, and other physical attributes. The rage of racism that's exhibited through physical attacks or killing of one's own group members. And so this whole idea about being bombarded over a lifetime with thoughts and attitudes and beliefs and that don't value who I am, but always put it in physical attributes as being the ways in which a person determines not only my potential, my success, my access. I can begin to internalize those things in ways that are damaging to me and my community. Environmental racism is yet another racism that we don't talk very much about. And this is the placement of toxic and hazardous waste sites, landfills, and polluting industries and African American, Asian, other communities of color, and working poor communities. This is we saw this with the water situation in Flint, Michigan. We saw it at Standing Rock, as it was also about water. And so environmental racism happens in ways that impacts communities. We know if we just look at the history of Columbus, if you were just to take a look, and you would see where decisions were made about highways going through. And in some instances, they went right through communities in ways that had long-lasting impact on not only housing, but also businesses. And again, the toxic and hazardous waste materials, if anyone's ever interested in just doing some research on that, it's often amazing about where how those decisions are made for landfills and other things that might be polluting, essentially over time, even water that's available. So again, communities' housing values decrease when they find out it's been built on a toxic landfill, of course. Children experiencing symptoms of asthma and lead poisoning based on a chemical plant that's in their community, or lead poisoning that was in paint from many low-income housing. There was just a report released a year or so ago that there are still some low-income housing developments that are using lead-based paints. State and city officials that don't apply the environmental laws, regulations, and practices across all communities. We know that when communities are not necessarily seen as voting and valuable constituents, then decisions are made based on that. And so I'd like to share this visual that I think really helps us to understand what the impact of racism can have on this thing we call the American dream. This was done by Horsey, and it was posted in the Los Angeles Times, but it was a very interesting visual to help us see when we start this American dream game, or seeking this American dream in life. What does it look like in America? What has it looked like in America historically when we start off being white versus being racialized as Black? And we see it starts with slavery, or enslavement, as I prefer to call it, then Jim Crow, lynchings, denial of voting rights, the Ku Klux Klan, as a hate, sharecropping, segregation, the bias in the courts, all the way through as we go to civil rights, having schools that are not funded equitably, and then therefore education not being as good. And then when we look across the bottom, all the way to the wealth gap, and then we look across the bottom, it's like we see that there was the land that was taken from indigenous populations, hundreds of years of free labor from enslaved and Africans, and then it's a straight path as we see it, versus one that is fraught with many other things. This is what happens within a system of racism. There are some individual pieces to that, but mostly these are things that an individual does not have control over, but are part of the system. And so I'd like to move us now to, we've had those definitions: race, a system of advantages and disadvantages based on race, and that also that privilege with power equaling racism, the whole idea that we have all these ways in which racism enacts itself. It can be individual, it can be institutional or systemic. There's cultural racism, and then internalized environmental racism. And so we have all of those ways in which racism enacts itself. So now what does it mean if we're going to understand what it means to be anti-racist? And we've heard a lot of that in the news as we saw what happened to George Floyd with the police officers, and this whole idea that now racism, it's always been there, but we've got a wake-up call that says, whoa, this is not how we want to engage and behave in society. And so that means We've got to do something about racism. And so Angela Davis made this quote many years ago: in a racist society, it is not enough to be non-racist. We must be anti-racist. And Ibrahim Kendi has written several books, which I'll share toward the end, about how not to be an anti-racist. But, you know, over my lifetime, and maybe even I'm sure in yours, you have heard people say, but I'm not a racist. People don't want to be seen or called racist. That's just, no, I'm not. But what we have found from not only the early work of people who have done anti-racist work all the way through to today, to just say I am not a racist or to be a non-racist is not enough. So no one is born racist or anti-racist. No one is born enacting advantage or disadvantage against another person. No one is born with enacting their power for discrimination or, you know, the denial of access. The same way as no one is born being an anti-racist, taking on the thought of dismantling and challenging practices and policies to end and stop racist behaviors. These are a result of choices that we make. And those choices impact where we land, where our feet land on whatever side of this coin we find ourselves. This is a video that talks about what does it mean to be anti-racist. This whole idea that being anti-racist is about making choices. So, and they'll put that in the chat for you. But there's a part in the video that I'll just quickly share. And the man is talking about, you know, with all of the uprising that has happened about Black Lives Matter, this whole idea about fighting and enacting support, there are many folks who are just kind of sitting at home, watching it on television and saying, oh, wow, that's really awful, that's really awful, that's really awful. And they believe that that's not what we want to be as a society. But sitting on my couch, watching it and saying it's awful and I'm not a racist and I don't believe that that should be happening is not enough. Because that has been said year after year, generation after generation, and we still are living in a society for which it is endemically a part of daily living. So that means we have to get up and do something if we want to be considered anti-racist. And I say if, again, because not everyone wants to get up and be an anti-racist. And that's hard to hear, especially in our profession. No one wants to think that a teacher, a principal, an administrator, a school district, a Department of Education, no one wants to think that these folks are making the choice to be racist. But that may be the case. What we're doing this morning is having this meetup to say, if you want to be anti-racist, in your life personally, in your teaching, in the pedagogy that you choose as you move forward and live and breathe from this day forward, then that means you've got to get up and do some things, and you've got to do some things very differently than you've done them before. So I hope you really get an opportunity to take a look at that video. Ibrahim Kendi, who's written, like I said, a bunch of really wonderful books, he also says the same thing. One either allows racial inequities to persevere as a racist, or you confront racial equalities as an anti-racist. There's no in-between space. You can't be just not racist and be neutral, because that becomes a mask for racism. There's no in-between space. You either are going to be supporting it or supporting inequities, or you're going to be fighting against them. There's no place to be in between. Malini, whose last name I always mess up, and if you ever meet or know her, you should be able to tell her I didn't try to say it in front of other people because I mess it up. I keep practicing. But she talks about how anti-racism involves taking stock of and eradicating policies that are racist. They have racist outcomes, and making sure that ultimately we're working toward a much more egalitarian, equitable, or emancipatory society. So in both of these quotes, both of these folks are researchers, but they're also former educators, and they're talking about the fact that as we move forward in this work, personally, we have to first make a decision and understand what all of these things are, what all the forms of racism may be, that race itself is socially constructed, it's made up, it really doesn't exist. There's nothing biologically connected to any group of people that creates race. And then to understand that racism is a system of advantages and disadvantages based on race that gives privilege access because of power. Then once we understand that, then we can make choices that will require our ongoing self-awareness and self-reflection as we move through life, but especially as we take on the teaching and learning that we have signed up for. The absence of making these choices, as I said, will just reify, support, and facilitate racial inequities. So another really great quote here that was in a tweet by Ujima, she said that the beauty of anti-racism is that you don't have to pretend to be free of racism to be an anti-racist. Anti-racism is the commitment to fight racism wherever you find it, including in yourself. It's the only way forward. And the reason why I really love this is because one of the other things that Beverly Tatum, Dr. Tatum, talked about is that racism is in the air we breathe. We breathe it in and out every single day. We can't get away from it. You know, it's about, someone said, used another analogy about racism is not the shark in the water. Racism is the water. So we are bombarded with what it means to be in a racist society day in and day out. And you're not going to get rid of every single part and every single thing about what you believe and how you are, your attitude, your belief, and the things that you do. You're not going to get rid of all of those things before you can begin this fight. You don't have to. And that's the beauty of it. So as you are developing your own personal understanding of race and racism, don't get stuck on, well, I've got to do this and I've got to read more. I've got to do all of these things, because those things aren't necessary. You don't have to be completely thinking I'm now racism free and now I can do this work. That's not what's necessary for you to get into the fight. Here are a couple resources. As I talked about Ibrahim Kennedy's book about how to be an anti-racist. It's very accessible. And when I say accessible, it means that, you know, while there's some research stuff in there for the research nerds like me, it's not written from that voice. He is talking to you as if you were, he's like sitting in your living room, having a conversation about what does this mean. He also has written a children's book, a baby book called Anti-Racist Baby. He has written a book called Stamped by Jason Reynolds that is written for middle school, like upper grade, upper elementary and middle and high school. And then this one, which is for pretty much, it could be for high school to adult. So he's written across all of the spectrum, and they all are wonderful for having those conversations. Another really wonderful book is White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo. Robin has done a fantastic job of talking about why is this so hard for white people to talk about racism. And this isn't a pointing the finger. It's not a blame game. It's not about, oh, you bad white people. This is about, let's talk about historically what has been in place that makes it very hard for those of us in these different positionalities to have this very needed, courageous conversation. And then the last one is by Ijoma. She wrote a book, So You Want to Talk About Race. And she, again, another very down-to-earth writer that says, if you want to have these conversations and grow to a place where you not only understand more about race and racism, but you want to become an anti-racist, which is fighting to dismantle and confront racism wherever it's happening, then she lays out how you can not only start the conversations, but what you need to do moving forward. So I'm going to pause for just a minute here and talk about some of the best practices. And this will be taken up a little bit more in the next virtual meetup, but I didn't want to leave without giving just a little bit here. If you want to know, one of the best practices around teaching about race and having the conversation about race is to really learn more about the social construction, as we've talked about earlier, including, how race really creates a system of advantage and disadvantage. Knowing that, reading about that in those 3 resources that I shared with you are wonderful ways to get more information around that. Reflect on your own racial identity. Often when I teach my students at the university and I would ask them to raise their hand if they have a race, my white students don't raise their hand. And I'm like, yeah, you've been racialized in this society. You've been racialized as white. If I ask them to raise their hand to talk about their culture, many of my white students don't raise their hand. I'm like, hey, hold up, wait, you do have culture. And I use an example with them around birth order. We like, who's the oldest in the family? Who's the youngest in the family? Has anybody ever called you, if you're the oldest, a bossy person? If you're the baby of the family, has anybody ever said, oh, you get your way, you got away with everything, got away with murder in the family? And what happens in a diverse group is folks understand that they all have culture. They all have some racialized identity. We just don't mark whiteness as race. And that's a whole conversation for a whole nother day, but something else for you to think about. Getting a sense of safety around the conversation, talk to people that you respect, talk to people that you care about. Let's not get caught up in the blame game. And then give yourself permission to make mistakes. It's okay to make mistakes. It's just not okay to keep making the same mistake. Again, then just being very deliberate and creating a blueprint that is going to sustain your curiosity, your inquiry, your challenging, and to meet the needs of not only colleagues, but others as you explore this thing about race. Build some relationships, find some people who are different from you, develop those relationships, not so that they take the responsibility of teaching you, but so that you can person to person, spirit to spirit, heart to heart, I really believe that's important, begin to make those connections. We talked about going from the personal to the institutional to the societal. That's very important. And then figure out what your assumptions are. What do you assume about particular groups of people? We all bring those, but get below that. Get more to factual information. Find answers. And when you find information that's incorrect, fix it. And then share it as a new window to your understanding. I'm watching our time here. Really moving from difference to dominance. Again, talk about your experiences as a member of a racial group or an ethnic group. And then listen to others, really exploring what it means around issues of dominance. We talk about race and racism, but we'll also find that there'll be sexism and there may be homophobia in there because we're not single issue people. We can't be single issue people, as Audre Lorde said, because we don't live single issue lives. Multiple places of oppression and anxiety come up in our lives. So have those conversations. And then move from the concrete to the more abstract. That's where the anti-racism is going to come. You're going to begin to say, okay, this is what's happening in my life and concretely, but let me look beyond that to pay attention to practices and policies. Racial literacy is really, truly a great exemplar. It's a whole thing, a whole area of study and research, but it's also very practical for the classroom. And in the next virtual meetup, I'm going to talk about how using racial literacy for teaching and learning in the classroom is very useful. But it's helping you understand that race is socially constructed, as we talked about it. It's not a biological reality, and that it was set up to govern and gain control over people's behavior. And it involves all of these things, understanding that power and race and privilege, as we talked about, are all tied together. Being able to locate and really analyze what social systems look like. Possessing the grammar, vocabulary, really about the language, figuring out what their language and the discourse is around all of these interactions, figuring out the difference between ethnicity, nationality, discrimination, prejudice, stereotyping. It's really important because sometimes we conflate these all into one. And as we conflate them, then things get lost. And so this racial literacy is a framework for teaching and understanding about how we can then move from the conceptual understandings about what all of these things are to the actual teaching, the on the ground, every single day working with our children and young adults as we move forward. Racial literacy gives a framework for us to be able to do that. And so finally, when we think about racial literacy, one of the things that it would definitely help us be able to do in the classroom, but first of all for ourselves, is how do we read, recast, and resolve? What racial understandings do we bring to these two images, for an example, in our own lives, so that we can figure out, okay, when we see these, what did we read this to be? And now, given the knowledge and understanding and the information, how do we then recast this in a way that we look at all of the different levels of racism, from individual to institutional to systemic? Where do we go there? And then as an individual, how do we resolve this for ourselves in ways that help us to think about how, if we want to do anti-racist work, we move forward? This particular image was shared with me from a 12-year-old neighbor who said that this was text to him after George Floyd's death. And the 12-year-old said to me, he said, "You know what, Doc, when I saw these two pictures side by side, I got it. I never thought that Colin Kaepernick was doing the right thing, and I was really angry and mad about it. But when I saw these two pictures side by side, I understand it. And so can you talk to me a little bit more about what I need to be thinking about when it comes to racism?" He's 12 years old, white male, and he began that conversation with me. So again, reading, recasting, and resolving in ways that help us negotiate. So finally, the thing to think about for your own personal understanding, and if you leave this and you don't do anything else, understand that one of the most powerful ways to disrupt racism and become an anti-racist, if that is your choice, is to engage in really brave conversations with people that are the closest to you. And then look at that circle of people who are the closest to you and see who's not there. If I wanted to get better understanding about gardening, I probably won't hang out with my friends who don't like to garden. Now, I can read a lot, I can understand it, but to really expand my knowledge base from an experiential perspective, I'm going to have to bring in some different people. So those closest to you, and pay attention to who that circle is and develop those relationships. And then finally, from a place of curiosity and care, show and recognize that this is really about cultural humility. And that's another body of research that I'll share at the next virtual meetup. But if you're not going to be there, you might want to look this term up. Cultural humility is really about a lifelong process of critical reflection, looking at yourself, and then inquiry, asking questions from a place of curiosity, and not just a place of curiosity and care that acknowledges the power imbalances that are in society, and then how we got here. Excuse that typo for those of you who caught that right away. Sorry about that. I'll just quickly say that when I was in second grade, I told my second grade teacher, I said, Mrs. Brown, one day we're going to have a machine that will do spelling for us. And so we won't ever have to have a spelling test anymore. And now see, here we are, and that's happening. And Miss Brown didn't really listen to me back then. But anyway, pretend like the machine has corrected that. Finally, though, I want to say thank you all so very much for walking this walk, understanding that until you know yourself better, until you use your personal beliefs and values, your awareness, your consciousness, your unconsciousness to understand race and racism, that will be foundational for you as teachers moving forward, because all your teaching and all your pedagogy is rooted in the foundation of more than what you just believe about teaching and learning. It is deeply rooted in every part of who you are as it interacts with all of the humanity in our society. And so hopefully this has given you some place to begin to better understand and get a grasp on how you're learning more about yourself. And these things will inform your teaching. And so it's Q&A time. My timer just went off to Elizabeth. Should I stop sharing my screen?
I think that's a wonderful place for you to stop and leave that screen there. It looks perfect. Kathy will start with questions. There are some really good ones in the chat. So Kathy, you're on.
I'm not hearing anything, but.
I'm sorry, it helps when you hit that mute button. I'm so sorry. Good morning. And the first question comes from a science teacher who teaches in a 99% white school system, and she's white. She says, for several years, I have done an assignment called a career genogram, where students ties together a family tree with careers held by individuals in their family with the goal of expanding their knowledge, appreciation of family, career, work efforts, and to relate that to themselves and their work and career goals post high school or post college. I have found that roughly 80% of my students can trace to their parents' level in the family tree. However, they do not possess enough information to place their grandparents or great-grandparents on the family tree, and that their parents are unable to supply them with that information. As it relates to race, I feel this phenomenon means I am teaching white youth who are unable to relate their existence to forebears from whom they inherited white privilege. My question for you is, how do you think a lack of depth of knowledge of heritage of white privilege might affect white youth's ability to see white privilege manifesting in themselves and to see white privilege as a historically developed and cultivated manner of existence in their families and communities? And I've also posted this in the Q&A so that you can follow along.
Okay, well, that's a nice long question. It's a good question. I think that the participant is absolutely right that a lack of understanding of the historical nature of white privilege and the generational inheritance around that privilege does operate as a barrier to people being able to do this very assignment that you're talking about. I would suggest that perhaps you, because remember we're talking in this particular session mostly about your personal understanding around these issues, that you do the same career genogram for your family, that you take your family and your heritage and trace it back as far as you possibly can as it relates to this career history. And then identify for yourself the places where your understanding of white privilege, the advantages that have been heaped upon your family as it relates to careers, would then be a way for you to help your students be able to ask and facilitate with their families how to be able to do that. I also highly encourage you to take a look at the systemic racism video that was put in the chat, I believe. I think they said they were going to put that in the chat, because that helps you understand that, you know, how does individual family wealth happen, and how has it happened since the time of enslavement to Jim Crow? Looking at the wealth gap that has happened across experiences. And as you look at the wealth gap, then you're able to see what kinds of things inherently came as privilege, especially as white identified privilege, to your family. And then hopefully that will help you with being able to fill in those gaps with the students. I think it's an outstanding example, but very few people are going to be able to say, okay, my family received this because after Reconstruction and Jim Crow, we were able to do this, like get a home. One of the things that the video talks about, the mortgage lending and what happened in the creation of the suburbs versus urban and center city living, and how that helped to build a wealth for families who were white. And in these neighborhoods, they had within the clauses that these homes could not be sold to Black or brown people. And so if you're able to do that, I would suggest that that would be a way for you to really be able to see where you could help facilitate filling in those gaps for your students. Another question?
Yep, Dr. Tyson. Is internalized racism psychologically damaging to individuals? And if so, can individuals recover from that, and how?
In a word, yes. Anything that you internalize about yourself that is damaging or that is negative is going to be damaging. So I'll use an example of something that's not as heavy, but let's talk about learning how to swim. Mm-hmm. If you have been told from the time that you were a child that water is dangerous, you need to be careful around water, you could drown, and you're told stories about people who, somebody in your family, if it was a mother or father or caregiver, we know someone who drowned, and there's constantly these negatives, and you're not going to be safe in the water, you're never going to learn how to swim, you're not going to do those things. As you internalize those things and you become an adult, and I would say not even adult, but even maybe a young adult, and even teen, adolescent, and young adult, and then you have internalized that water is dangerous. You have internalized that water could kill you. And that's a negative message. So then when it's time for you to learn how to get in some water, or someone wants to teach you how to swim, guess what? You're not going to do that. And you're going to fight as hard as you possibly can to not engage in that. So yes, is it psychologically damaging? Absolutely. Being fed any constant diet of negativity about self or about a group of people for which you are a cultural member and have a shared membership would have damage. Now, can you talk about overcoming that? Absolutely. Because we know that any kind of damage to a person's self-esteem, to the narrative that people are taught, even from families or in schools or from communities, that they are. I mean, I use myself as an example to say that while lots of these things were happening, I got positive net messages that contradicted, though, the things that I heard in society. So if my teacher said, like I had a first grade teacher that once asked me where I lived, and when I told her where I live, and she says, oh, well, you don't even have to worry about school or college or all, because most of the people down there are, I lived in a low-income housing. Oh, you're gonna become this, that, and the other. You may end up in jail. I mean, this was said to me as a 6-year-old. But I was hearing very opposite messages in my home and in my community and my church. At home, I was hearing, you're the smartest first grader in the whole wide world. In church, I was hearing, you can do anything you ever want to do. And so in my community, my family, my community of faith, I heard the opposite. So then I was able to emerge out of that, not internalizing the messages of negativity. The challenge, especially for those of us who are in schools and are teaching young people, the challenge is they may not ever hear some of those positive counter messages. And so the question becomes, will you take it on as your responsibility to say, what may be happening here is this student has internalized a message about their ability, their intellectual ability. They may have internalized a message about their inherent worth and humanity. And I'm going to take on that as an anti-racist educator to make sure that I bring different messages and engage with them in ways that they can, even though they may have internalized some of that, to begin to externally experience a kind of success that would be the counter narrative. So the short answer is, yes, it does have damage, and yes, it can be overcome, but it takes work, and it takes care, and it takes intentionality, especially from teachers as we interact with kids in schools and even with their families and communities.
Thanks, Dr. Tyson. The next question is, it is my perception that most teachers and realtors are white females. How difficult will this be to change this in a 5 to 10 year stretch of time so that teaching and realtors are people from different genders and ages and backgrounds and are more representative of humanity themselves?
Great question. As it relates to teachers, you may be aware of many of the initiatives that are looking to diversify the teaching force. As a teacher educator at Ohio State University, in the last 10 years, I can count on one hand, and not using just my fingers, how many students I've had that were Black, Brown, Indigenous people of color. And we just don't have folks who are choosing to become teachers. And part of it, I think, is reaching back into the schools. Some of you might even remember, as I date myself here, that there were organizations, like there was a club for future teachers in high school, and you could join that club and you got connected with people who were teachers, and you were able to think about teaching as a career. I think we have to go back to the pipeline. We hear people talk about the school to prison pipeline. If we were to pay closer attention, and I believe have a school to the classroom as a teacher pipeline, we could do that so that we identified young people much earlier, maybe even in upper grade level elementary school. Let's talk about what it would mean to be a teacher. So that's one way. But in the short term, we also have quite a pool of people who are retired, people for whom they are looking for second careers. And I think that that's an untapped resource pool for us to diversify our teaching. And you say also real estate. I don't know real estate and what it takes to become a realtor, so I can't speak to that. But I would suspect that that would also be possible. So when we have people, for an example, I just spoke to a man, young, well, he's still young, even though he's like 66. But these days, it's like people have already spent a career, and he's in electrical engineering. And I'm having conversations with him about how about come back and be a mathematics teacher in middle or high school? And let's talk about what it would take for you to get through a program so that you can get credentialed to be a high school or a middle school mathematics teacher. And he's really, really interested because he said he hadn't thought about that in retirement, that he might be able to take that up. So I think part of it is the pool But, I will also say to the participant that for many people, Black, Brown, Indigenous, and people of color, school has not been a great experience. So if I've not had a good experience in an educational setting, then I'm not likely to want to choose that as my career path. And I've heard many young people say that to me as well. Well, I hate school. I can't wait to get out of school. School is the worst place in my life. And no, I would never want to be a teacher because of that. So, on both fronts, from the recruitment space to also what kind of experiences our young people, these students are having, impacts that. Will it change in the next 5 to 10 years? I'm really not sure. But one of the things that I have devoted and committed my life to is not diversifying the teaching force. And this is a reflection of my age. That doesn't mean I don't want more diverse people there, because I really do. But I am becoming a very realist and looking at who do I have in front of me. And if my class in teacher education is 99.9% white and female, then I have dedicated my life to say, how do I help these people who are in front of me be the best teachers that they can be, so that they can provide not only academic achievement and access and, helping these students be the best that they can be, because I'm worried not about 5 to 10 years from now. I'm worried about the students that they're going to be teaching in August when they graduate from our program. And I need to make sure that I've given them what they need. And so I would encourage each and every one of you who have that to help a teacher who may be white and female, who doesn't have the requisite experience to be able to become an anti-racist teacher, to join you in this journey, to have those conversations, to be better in the classrooms right now, because they've got students in front of them now that need them to be that kind of teacher.
Next question, Dr. Tyson, is what are your thoughts on the older Black generation not supporting the Black Lives Matter movement?
Well, I don't know what data this person is using to ask that question. I can't speak on the older Black generation from a very generalizable situation, because I don't know that to be true. I know that across any group of people, whatever the movement might be, there will be people who will join because they agree with it, and there'll be those that don't, for whatever those reasons may be. I have found in my own experience, and I only can speak from my own experience, that many of the people who are part of the older generation are very much in favor of anything that is going to confront and dismantle racism, especially the kind of racism that they have lived with over many generations. I will add too that in some of my conversations, I speak with those those who are elders and the senior saints, as we sometimes call them in my community, and many of them are tired. What does it look like or feel like to be 80, 90 years old and still dealing with the systemic ways in which racism is enacted in ways in your life? So it's almost as if, one person I talked to just the other day who's 93 years old, and she's like, I'm just tired. I'm happy that the young people are doing this. I'll support in any way I can, but I just don't have the energy to take this up any longer. So again, that's my own personal experience. And again, I can't speak in any generalizable way to say that as a whole, the older generation is not supporting. And I would encourage anyone who believes that to make sure that if that is your belief, that you share information that supports that beyond just maybe an anecdotal note here or there. Even if you read it in an article somewhere, that takes us back to what I talked about earlier, that you need to do some research and find out as much information as you possibly can so that it doesn't become a stereotypical perspective about a particular group of people.
Dr. Tyson, this will be our last question. Is there something to be said for the time after slavery had ended and Black people were all of a sudden, in quotes, free, but perhaps may not have found the necessary skills within themselves right away to make choices because as slaves, they were not allowed to make their own choices? What impact, if any, does this have on African Americans today in general?
Okay, thank you. Absolutely. From enslavement to the quote unquote free time, we know that if you go back and look at the game, visual that I shared, all of those things that were there, and they were put in place absolutely to impede choice and liberty and rights, all of those things that our constitutional republic said was the inalienable right of all. We know that all did not include those newly enslaved or the newly freed enslaved Africans. But I will push back on the question just a little bit because the person said may not have had it in themselves. And I would push back on that to say that enslaved Africans were humans who came from thriving kingdoms and communities and societies. So they arrived in 1619 on this soil with a lot in themselves, a lot of self-determination, a culture, a heritage, a language, all of the things that we believe are a part of what makes us humans. Intellectually and mind, body, and spirit, all of those things were inherent and were a part of them even during enslavement. So yes, the choices may have been taken away, but what wasn't taken away was all of the generational wealth and knowledge, all those funds of knowledge about living and breathing and knowing how to be in the world intellectually and spiritually was still a part of who they were. So even though we went through eras of Jim Crow laws that, limited choices in terms of how people could move in the world, or the denial of being able to vote with voter registration and voting tests and voting rights being denied, paying attention to the ways that segregated, the separate but equal ways in which education was rolled out. All of these things definitely limited choices. But one of the things that has been a part of that history, that historical legacy, is the fact that in themselves and within themselves, Black and Brown, Indigenous, and other people of color who have been victims, and I don't like to use the word victims, but have been faced with the challenges of this legacy of oppression, have found ways to make the kind of choices to become educated, to be contributing members of society. I stop and I think and give a moment of pause in my heart and my spirit to Congressman John Lewis, who we just lost, who through his whole life talked about getting in that good trouble. And getting in that good trouble was because deep within himself, and I would say within many Black and Brown, Indigenous people of color, in themselves, they have what it takes to make those choices and to educate themselves and to be participating people in society in ways that make not only society better, but makes our neighborhoods, communities, families, and for us on this call, teachers better. So yes, there definitely was some impact and continues to be impact, but I do believe that through the struggle, folks do have within themselves across multiple areas of oppression to overcome those things and be productive and successful.
Dr. Tyson, I want to thank you for this conversation this morning. It has been amazing. We have learned a great deal from you and are looking forward to continuing that conversation with you next week. I can tell you that there are many, many more questions than there was time to address them, but a lot of them are deeply connected to curriculum and teaching practice, and I know that that will be part of your focus when the next meetup occurs. To those of you participants, there will be a link in the Q&A. If you click on that link, it will take you to a very short survey, and completing that survey will generate your certificate of participation for this meetup. Again, thank you to all of you that chose to participate. It is with people like you that we can make progress.